Canada's drugs crisis has some policymakers looking away from measures such as harm reduction and toward expansion of treatment beds. And along with that has come discussion of measures to compel addicts into treatment. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Vancouver Sun reporter Lori Culbert joins me to discuss how involuntary treatment works, the legal questions around the practice, and the stories of some patients who've been forced into treatment. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Lori, there's been a big debate brewing in Canada about how to manage addictions issues. And one of the strategies that we're seeing crop up in some provinces is the idea of involuntary treatment. And we can talk about some details about numbers and even how it affects some people. But at a very basic level, what is involuntary treatment and where is it currently being used?
So involuntary treatment is really just what it sounds like. It's someone being forced against their will into a residential treatment center, increasingly because they are dually diagnosed with both mental health and substance abuse challenges. And I mean, really, for all intents and purposes, this has always existed in Canada. I mean, historically, judges have, been able to send people into involuntary care when they are in front of the justice system. In British Columbia, where I am, for example, there's 2,000 spots that already exist in BC psychiatric wards or mental health facilities. What's new and what's controversial in multiple provinces, including Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia, is this idea of expansion and having people being involuntarily held in jails and detention centers in response to some really disturbing and concerning acts of violence on the streets.
So you mentioned judges in BC. How is it that someone kind of comes to being involuntarily sent to treatment? What are the measures? How are they implemented? And what criteria are people being categorized under as needing to be essentially held against their own volition and given mental health or addictions treatment?
I would say the expansion of involuntary care in British Columbia, where I work, is fairly new. And so it's a little bit unclear at this point what criteria is being used. And I think that people that are critics of this expansion are asking those very questions. And I think we're going to have to see how this rolls out and who becomes involved in this involuntary care before we truly know the answers to the questions that you raise. Here in British Columbia, the 28 new beds that were rolled out this spring for involuntary care, 10 of them were at a pretrial center where people who have been arrested in the criminal justice system are sent pending their trial or first court appearance. And so those 10 beds are supposed to be for people with mental health and addiction issues who are ensnared in the criminal justice system. There's an additional 18 new involuntary care beds that are at a provincial jail in Maple Ridge, which is a suburb of Vancouver. And that's for people both in and out of the criminal justice system. And again, the criteria is that people have severe mental health and addictions issues. And perhaps just to back up a little bit to give this context, in Vancouver, we've had a spate of really disturbing violent stranger attacks on the streets. And this became a real issue in our provincial election last fall. So our NDP government, they hadn't been discussing the expansion of voluntary care, but the opposition Conservatives were really pushing the issue during the election and gaining voter support. And it was really our Premier, David Eby, who made a sudden about face in the midst of the provincial election to say that he was going to expand this, which caught a lot of people off guard. But in the end, the NDP won the election, and he's now following through with that promise.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, BC currently has about 2,000 treatment beds for involuntary treatment. How many people have gone through this system over the last few years, or has the number increased?
Well, it's interesting. Those beds can be used for voluntary and involuntary care. So, in other words, people who voluntarily want to go in for help and those who are forced in. And what the BC Ombudsperson has found is that the number of British Columbians who are forced into treatment has risen steadily since 2011, nearly almost doubling in number. But by comparison, patients who are choosing this care, those numbers have remained largely stagnant over that time frame.
Now, when we talk about an expansion of these services, and I know, as you mentioned, BC is adding more beds, and Alberta, who's pursuing what they call compassionate intervention, is increasing the number of treatment beds. But is the treatment system equipped to handle a growing influx of people ordered into recovery on top of those who are already there seeking treatment?
Well, I think we know that there is a huge shortage of proper treatment beds, of nurses and doctors with specializations in this area. You know, capacity in the treatment system has been an issue for years and years, and it's been a frequently raised question here in BC about how to staff an increase in these new facilities. And it will be interesting to monitor that to see if they can continue with the staffing levels that they need.
We'll be right back. Looking at some of the people who might deal with clients of these services, lawyers, because we're talking about the criminal justice system, and mental health experts, what is the general consensus of those people when it comes to whether this is a good idea, a bad idea, or something to at least try? Because we are seeing growing issues with addiction and mental health problems on the streets in cities across Canada.
Yeah, so I would say there is no general consensus. Like any controversial topic, there is a wide variety of opinions. I spoke with 3 people who have experience with involuntary care. And for one of those people, a man named Chris, I spoke with his lawyer. And, his lawyer said to me that for someone like his client who had a lifelong challenge with mental illness, that the justice system was, quote unquote, a blunt instrument to try to deal with his health issues, and that involuntary care was a good alternative to the justice system. In Chris's case, a forensic social worker and a prosecutor agreed at trial that involuntary care was the best option for him. And Chris's lawyer would argue he's made a remarkable turnaround. I spoke with another defense lawyer who made the argument that this is stripping people of their constitutional rights, and that there is no evidence that forced treatment reduces future hospitalizations or future run-ins with the criminal justice system. And I mean, there are certainly organizations like the BC Mental Health Association that talk about the fact that if we want to address mental health and drug addiction crises head on, we need to be improving supports so people never hit that crisis point in the first place. So I think you're just going to hear so many different opinions on the effectiveness of this direction.
I imagine it does depend on the person's circumstance as well. And I guess we can jump to some of the people that you spoke with, and you mentioned Chris's lawyer. What was Chris's situation? Was it addictions? Was it mental health? Was it a combination of the two? And how would he describe his experience going through this process?
Yeah, so when I spoke with Chris, he was 45 years old. He had suffered a lifetime of battling mental illness and associated substance use, but had not become intertwined with the criminal justice system until COVID. And at that time, he was working on an oil rig. He lost his job on the rig because of things being shut down during the pandemic, and he really spiraled downwards. In 2023, he pleaded guilty to randomly assaulting a stranger on a downtown street in Kelowna. You know, he wrongly thought the woman who was talking on her phone was filming him. And, he really frightened this victim when he pushed her and, slammed her phone on the ground. He admitted that at that point in his life, he was desperate, that he was suicidal. And when he was put into involuntary care at a treatment center in Coquitlam, just outside of Vancouver, he found there that the treatment program worked for him. He started to use day passes to go out and start to, mingle again in society. He said, and I'm quoting here, "It's actually made me a better person. This has been a really big step in making me sober." He is now working outside the facility, but living in secondary housing at the treatment center. You know, this has been an improvement for Chris, but he would say that it's not perfect. He said he wishes there was something in the healthcare system that would have allowed him to achieve the success without giving up his freedom. Because with involuntary care, you walk into a facility, they lock the door behind you, and you need to earn the right to leave again. And so, I think, again, Chris will tell you that it worked for him, but that he would like to see changes to the system. And in particular, and I think this is really important, he's feeling like he's made adjustments in his life. He's sober now, he's working, he's mentally stable, but he's terrified about leaving the grounds of the facility because there's a shortage of affordable, safe, supportive housing in Vancouver and in many urban centers across the country. So it's like the whole system is a little bit fractured, right? And if you have people spend time getting better in involuntary care, you then need, the affordable housing and support in the community to allow them to continue on that positive road ahead.
Yeah. And when you talk about the system and issues within the system, another one is, the ability to access care when problems arise and whether timely care can prevent someone going down the road that where they need to be put into treatment involuntarily. And that gets me to Jane and Richard. And I'm curious what their story was and their experience was with involuntary treatment.
Yeah, Jane and Richard's story is just so heartbreaking. I mean, they were teenage high school boyfriend, girlfriend. When Richard was 20, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and Jane was just 18 at the time, but determined that they could, get through this together. But she said ultimately, quote unquote, they were doomed to fail. She just said that he was taken into involuntary care 3 or 4 times when his schizophrenic behavior became so extreme, and that he was destructive. He did get involved in the criminal justice system. He started using substances, but that the amount of time he was in involuntary care was very short, and it didn't help him sufficiently. He became homeless. His mental health exacerbated. And I think for Jane and Richard's parents, who continued to be supportive of their son, she said that she and her in-laws, they could see the train coming down the tracks. They could see the warning signs when Richard was starting to have a breakdown, and they would call his doctor or call 911 or phone the police. But she said they got trapped into this cycle of him never being, quote unquote, bad enough to be admitted into hospital or to be taken into care, until his behavior would just escalate to the point that he was breaking furniture harming other people. And she was so frustrated by a system that wasn't nimble enough to jump in early enough to help someone like Richard before he got to that crisis point.
And lastly, you talk to someone whose experience, even though ultimately she appears to, based on my read of the story, appears to have come out and has turned her life around from some pretty severe mental health issues, hasn't spoken very positively of the experience. And I'm wondering what you can tell me about Nicole and her experiences being sent to treatment involuntarily, but also what about it didn't work for her, or why it wasn't the right fit. Because I believe in your story, she talks about she'd rather wind up on the streets dealing with street drugs than be put into forced treatment again.
Yes. So Nicole struggled with mental health issues from early childhood. She's a very bright young woman who was doing her PhD at Oxford University in England. One of the times that she had a mental health breakdown and landed in involuntary care again. But you're right, she described every experience she had in involuntary care as dehumanizing. And she is now sober. She no longer takes drugs, but she told me, and I'll quote, "I would choose fatally overdosing over ever having to be involuntary detained and institutionalized again." She just said that the experience of being held against her will, and especially as a teenager and someone in her young 20s, in adult psych wards where there were as many people who were older than her, who had perhaps more severe mental health issues than her, she found it terrifying to be in there. She often found that she didn't understand what was happening to her, that it wasn't properly explained. She would wake up, her clothes had been cut off. She was in handcuffs. She had a catheter inserted into her. She was often in isolation rooms. She said that she would bide her time in there until she could be released, but that it did not help her. It did not address her mental health challenges. And in fact, she would argue that it in fact made them worse, that she spent the next many years believing that her brain was broken, believing that the negative things that had been said to her in involuntary care were true. It's interesting. She said to me that she has an extreme amount of sympathy for someone like Jane, who was desperate to get Richard into involuntary care because she believed it would really help them. Nicole, she said she has sympathy for that point of view, but for her, she said involuntary care just simply didn't work.
It's one of those things where even the right program can have a great deal of impact for somebody. The wrong program or the wrong approach in treating them when you're talking about mental health, because it is not an exact science, it can have major detrimental effects for somebody, right? I think that's a prevailing sense of the mental health system in general, that some supports are great for some people, but not for others. And some treatment methods are great for some people and not for others.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why it's very important for, all the experts and the media to be really on top of how involuntary care expands in provinces like British Columbia and Alberta and Ontario in the, coming months and years, just so we can see if it is effective, if it is helpful, or if in some cases it might be harmful.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are, very important, compelling stories, especially as the debate grows across Canada. Lori, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me. 10-3
is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Lori Culbert. More from her at vancouversun.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.